Good. Uh, we are live. Hello, everybody. Hi, Katrine.
Hi, Pascal. Welcome, everybody. How are you, Pascal?
I'm fine. Thanks a lot. As you see, summer is coming on my side.
Looks very green in your background. I like it.
It does.
Welcome, everybody, to this seventh episode of our Piece of the Puzzle podcast. In this episode, we talk about a white paper that was published in January 25, so just quite recently this year. It's called Fast Track Negotiations. It's authored by Mark Freeman, who's the director of the Institute for Integrated Transitions. And we chose it because it sounded quite interesting in its approach. So the summary of the paper is really, it argues that the dominant model for negotiation for peace and stability is no longer compatible and works well with the complex conflict dynamics that we now see emerging. So that it is inefficient, it's too slow, it doesn't deal with the complexity of conflicts. And so the paper argues that a new model is needed, and so it proposes a new paradigm, which is called a fast track negotiation model, which the paper argues should reach agreements quickly. And yeah, the model is designed for speed and it's pragmatic as well. And the paper then contrasts these two models. They call it the current model that is being used is called the model 0. And the paper then suggests model 1 as the new fast track model. And the structure of the paper basically first looks at the problem that we face, why the current model doesn't function anymore, and then proposes in the second part the fix, as it's called. And in the third part looks at the applications of the new model, so where it could work, and then also actually discusses, and this is, I think, the most interesting part, the objections to the model, to the new model that he proposes. And then there's a conclusion, of course, in the end. But Pascal, when you read it, what were some of your thoughts?
Thanks, Katrine. Yeah. So I read the paper with a couple of ideas in mind, what this could be about, and what Mark Freeman could be suggesting. Um, Actually, let me start maybe with the end of the paper that you just mentioned, the objections. So in the last part, he advances some potential objections, and I think one is number two. Objection number two is the one that I was most thinking of while reading the paper. And then I was actually happy that he addressed it in the end as an objection. And it's that fast track negotiation already exists, where he argues that the objection could be that it's, actually an already existing model that he puts out with different terms and so on, which is partly the impression I had while reading. And how he's arguing regarding this objection is, on one hand, saying that yes, it does exist for some specific situation, like ceasefire or hostage negotiation and so on, but that he sees his own approach or model or concept or however you want to call it. I think we can discuss this as well. What's the good terminology for it? As not something like narrow focused, but something much broader, like to stop violence on a large scale. So that's how he addresses that part of the possible objection. He says, yeah, it does exist, but only for very specific, narrow subjects like ceasefire, hostage situation, and so on. And the other one is that yes, it does exist, but not yet as a conceptual or methodological model. And that's personally where I find maybe the paper falls a bit short, because that's really the door that he opens. Is okay, there is something I call fast track negotiation. Some people somehow do it in some situations. We could maybe broaden it, develop it further, use it more broadly, and so on. And he also explains in one chapter how it can also be thought together with the model zero, as you said, like the, let's say, previous, what he calls previous, more transformational approach, and this one, that it is possible to think it together and so on. But then he's not really doing it himself. That's
Hmm.
what I found a bit a pity in the paper. It opens a big door, but he's not walking through. So
Hmm. Mm, yeah. I mean, I must say that I think the what really what I liked a lot is that he's courageous enough to challenge some of the paradigms that we take as granted that have been established, a long time ago on how we work. And he has the courage to really question them and say, transformation, does this make sense in a negotiation setting? So I think he definitely deserves credit for being able to question some of the assumptions that we have.
mm,
But I would agree with you that the way he presents the model zero, and I would actually also wonder, is there a model zero really? Do we have a model, or isn't it
mm,
just a, a set of principles that we use? So I would question indeed this idea that there is a model and that we always work in a certain way in a given conflict. So I think the way it's presented really looks like we're always looking at transformation, we're always looking at inclusivity, we're always looking at personal meetings, we're always going about it in a certain way, which I don't think really reflects the reality. I think it's always context driven. So the way he described the fast track model, I think some of the principles he mentions there are, as he also said, are already incorporated into the model zero, as he calls it. So yeah, the objections, definitely for me, they are very valid objections as well. And at the same time, I think there's some really interesting thoughts. I can maybe just mention one, and you probably have a few as well. So when he says transformation is often it makes everything cumbersome and takes away sort of the speed and the urgency of things. I can see that, and I think what his interesting point is that also the negotiation setting is not a space to work on transformation. So you need other spaces. I like that thought. I think it's really interesting. But then I think what I'm missing is this, like, okay, what are these other spaces? So
mm,
if we don't want to have transformation in the negotiation setting, where do we have it, right?
mm,
And I think that's, as you say, so there's a door open. It's an interesting thought, but then there's nothing sort of that really explains where can it be, how does it look like, what are some of the examples?
mm. I would have loved to see some, process designs, for instance,
Mm,
based on specific examples, how you have like a longer term process with transformational approach and so on, and democratic transition and everything might be needed. And then how this fast track approach fits in and where and how and with whom. That I think that's maybe for a next version of the paper, if there is one, that would be something informative to see. Another important point that he points out very rightly is that yeah, you mentioned it as well. Some absolutely justified critiques about yeah, the failures of many negotiations today, and I think it's about 50% of peace agreements that fail, and failing in a sense that violence breaks out again after a few years. So it's true, we can question it now. Is it is it a negotiation that failed? Is it the approach to a negotiation that was used that failed? Is it, I don't know, is it, I think those situations are so complex,
mm,
it's impossible to have like a direct causality and saying, look, this is the origin of the failure. But there definitely is a good point that those models, I wouldn't say, I don't know. Well, we will see if these models are tested, if the agreements hold longer, more than a few years, or if the same happens. Because I also saying this, if you if you see the principles from what he calls again the model zero, the transformative approach, I mean, he's not really, well, not really criticizing it. It's just, yeah, he's saying it's not really working anymore. We need to do it differently and so on. But if you say to people from, at least for me in my field, if you say, oh, transformational approach, inclusiveness and so on, if you say we don't need to do that anymore, there would be a quite an outcry, you know, because
Yeah.
so where is he right on that and where not? I mean,
Yeah.
it is
Yeah.
counterintuitive to say it doesn't need to be completely inclusive. I don't remember how he's arguing, but I think he's quite focused on top level. It's also quite a matter of what's your model of change, what's the theory of
Mm.
change.
Mm. But I think he criticizes model zero actually being focused on track one, and I would also debate that. I think there has been progress made in understanding that track one is an important um, process that definitely needs to be there to resolve a conflict. You need the really high level buy-in for sure, but it's not the remedy that like resolves the conflict in the long term for sure. So I think this is another thing where I felt like, well, nobody thinks this actually that it's track one that's important and there's a focus on track one only. So I think he points that out, and I mean a valid point is that the importance of local ownership, and that he sees it as a problem that it's often driven, I think, from outside, which is a really valid observation. I don't know how you thought about the argument he makes about conflict ripeness, because he's questioning that as well and says we're often waiting
Mm.
for the conflict ripeness and for this mutually hurting stalemate to occur, and that's actually not productive. And then I was thinking at some of the current conflicts and looking at, well, is the conflict ripe? And then also I'm actually questioning that, because I do think that there has to be a mutually hurting stalemate. And if that's not there, and I think, Ukraine, Russia is a really good example, or Gaza as well, where clearly one side doesn't feel the pain as much as the other, and it's
Yeah.
really very hard to negotiate in that case. But then he suggests, so rather than waiting for the ripeness to occur, is being proactive and probing and see. And I think that's definitely always valid, that you look
Yeah.
proactively at entry points, right?
Yeah, I think also because he's opposing, I'm just checking his tables where he's say kind of opposing the two approaches, like model one, ripeness must exist, and sorry, model zero, ripeness must exist, and model one, active probing is needed.
Mm.
I really like the idea. It's a little bit trial and error. Let's go that way. If it doesn't work, let's try something else. And but the thing is, even to do that, you need to have the people at the table.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
So
exactly.
if they're not
Yeah,
ready to come to the table, you cannot do your probing. You cannot do the approach. You know, that's a little bit where I'm not so sure how, yeah, how that changes from it's ripeness. You need depends on maybe what what you understand on the ripeness.
yeah, yeah,
Is
yeah.
it ripeness for the whole setting for negotiation, or is it like parties ready to negotiate?
Yeah.
Um,
Was there anything else that sort of stroke you
well,
as
this
an
brings me
interesting thought?
That brings me back to the track one that you mentioned, because if we don't wait for ripeness, we do active probing. But then with whom? I mean, how do you bring people to the table if they're maybe not ready, if it's not ripe yet? How about, is it some kind of power negotiation? But he's also questioning that from the outside. Did you?
Well, I
Like,
think the it sounds still quite well, it's pragmatic in
mm,
a way. So I think to some extent it's also transactional.
Mhm.
the focus is more on transaction, because it also criticizes, so not criticizes, but questions the transformative approach. And I think he also makes that point in sort of the key point of his model one is getting to yes. This is
Exactly.
really what he underlines. But then I also think getting to yes has been there for a long time. And it's part of any negotiation in a way, no matter what you're looking at, right? You're trying to come to an agreement. And that is behind every, also the more complex and maybe cumbersome processes. So also there, I find it's a bit contradictory in how he presents it. Um, yeah, what did you think?
Maybe I'm not sure that this his intention. Somebody, sorry, somewhere to the end, he says it can be complementary and so on. I think that maybe
Mm.
that should be earlier in the paper to
Mm. Mm.
to remove a little
Yeah.
bit this feeling of having two opposing models, because I think that's not the case. So for me, this is extremely clear that you need to use like the approach and the model and the tools that fit to the current situation. Like you mentioned, the Gaza war today, what we need is really quick, fast track. I mean, even faster as fast
Mm.
ceasefire, no?
Yeah. Yeah.
There is nothing, absolutely nobody asks for anything transformational right now. It doesn't make any
Mm.
sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
absolutely not the moment for something transformational right now. It will come, and I think it has to come. This doesn't include now something fast track immediate. Um, and there, I think this is something. I mean, the risking model dates from 1996, where we have the more, he calls it actually facilitative, which like similar to the transformative approach, and the evaluative one, so more quicker counseling and so on, and narrow or broad focus of the problem. Um, and already from that model, it is clear that you have to pick the right approach based on the need of the situation.
Yeah. Maybe I would be interested to hear from you, Pascal. You feel like there is actually a model in place? Can we talk about a model?
You mean now, currently,
I mean, do
before
we
or
have,
with
yeah,
the
can
paper?
we say there is a model zero and there is a model, and then let's develop a model one? Is there something like a model zero? Is it really a model in your thoughts?
To answer maybe the question. So one thing, when I read the paper, I thought even his own logic, in Freeman's own logic, there would be another model zero, which is, what that he pointed out during the Cold War and behind closed doors, negotiation and so on. So that would be model one if you really go that sequential order. Um, uh, but yeah, I mean, what does the term model exactly imply?
Mm, mm, mm,
Um, I would maybe rather say I don't know what the right term would be, but it's I think on one hand, it's what I can see is that some mediators have more a rush to go fast, whatever scale of mediation we're talking about. Some people are more focused on focused on the process and what are the needs of the people, and others are more focused on, what's the result, how do we get to something tangible quickly. But as soon as you know the different approaches, you do it the other way around. In that sense that you try to adapt your approach to the
mm.
needs.
Yeah.
Because you're questioning the term model in
I
which.
do a little bit because I think for me it's more it's a set of principles and approaches
Yeah.
more than a real model, because model in my mind is like very organized and sort of commonly agreed upon, and I would question that because I do
Mhm.
think that there are key principles that will be implemented in any context, but then there's a variety of different approaches that are sort of picked and chosen. So it's also like it's principles, and then there's a bit like a toolbox as well. But I guess, it's maybe just sort of a rhetorical question. Is there a model? I do think that it's really an important point to make, saying that
Well,
how we work. Yeah.
just to react on this, sorry, Katrine, but I think also that I think the term is really important because it maybe it frames something more concretely. Like this is, but I
Mm,
think that's what you're saying, if I understand right. This is
mm,
model zero, this is model one, and it's closing, it's isolating.
mm.
Whereas, as I understand you, if I understand you right, so it's much more overlapping and
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I think maybe for me, I'm also a bit questioning the term, because when I first read an overview of the paper, I think my expectations were very high, because I thought, oh, there's a new model,
okay, I see.
like a model. And it sounded like there could be like something a quite concrete, that hasn't been there before, or is not something that we know of. So I guess it's also a bit like how I approach then, the paper. But what I wanted to say is, where I find he's really spot on, is this noting that what we've achieved in the past 20 years, there's very little sort of comprehensive agreements that have been reached. So clearly something is missing, and we need to be critical. And I like that about his approach, that he's quite self-critical as well, because it takes courage, I think, to do that, and to go out and yeah, question some of
Hmm.
the assumptions we have, as I said.
Maybe I copied one sentence that refers to what we're discussing. So he says somewhere, firstly, as already noted, fast-track negotiation is not meant to replace the current negotiation paradigm. So here he calls it a paradigm. Instead, the aim is to overcome our overdependence on it,
Mm,
considering its mismatch to contemporary conflict and to urgent situations in general.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
he's mainly, but this is, I think, at almost at the end of the paper. But yeah, so he's criticizing the aim, the what is it, the over dependence
Mm, yeah,
on what
yeah,
he calls the current paradigm.
yeah. No, and I think also, as a conclusion, sort of what I felt, it's an overdue reset. He's like really pushing pause and say, okay, wait, let's think, is this really working, and what needs to change? And so I would hope that, as the door is open, some of, really interesting questions have been asked. Hopefully, some of the bits and pieces that are suggested can be picked up and further elaborated, because that would be really, really interesting.
Mm,
And one could think about choosing that really deliberately and saying, okay, so conflict ripeness is not necessarily something we're looking for. Okay, how can it look like then, right? And be a lot more concrete. Or inclusion. So inclusion at the negotiation table is not a number one priority any longer, but when does the inclusion then come in? What are the spaces it can
yeah.
come in, and when? And what are some of the examples, maybe?
Mm. Yeah, another point also is in the, how is he calling it? The set of principle and practices, what he calls the fix for for the problems of the
Mhm.
current, let's say, current approach. And he puts, I found it quite interesting, point five, digital reliance, saying
Yeah,
that in-person meetings should occur only at key junctures when needed to accelerate or finalize settlements, but most communication otherwise can be done over virtual and new tools and data tools and so on.
yeah.
Yeah, that's something which is a general, I think it's a shift on that.
Mm.
I would agree with him. Again, it depends on whom and what and when, at what stage and so on.
Yeah,
But that's something I can see where some people rely much more on new tools, new technology, and others are much more reluctant. Um,
yeah. No, and I think this in also in parallel, what I also liked is this idea to be a lot more, what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of demanding in terms of the production of outcomes, you know, his claim is like it's often the current model is often like an iterative process, and you lead the parties and something unfolds and you pick something up. And he says, you know, there needs to be very clear, like papers already floated. And I can absolutely see that, how you can really speed up a process very productively in trying to be like really not wait for too long, but already pick certain topics and work on something quickly that you then float and discuss. So there's good points definitely there, yeah. And together, as you said, with the digital, being more reliant on digital exchanges as well, for sure. Although I would then also question, can we reach everybody digitally? But anyway, we're not very inclusive, I think. So it doesn't, of course, you can't have a fast track when you try to have a very consultative deliberation. So I'm also contradicting myself here. But yeah.
But it really makes me think, and now again, while I read the paper and now while we discuss it again as well, it really makes me to think about my convictions, especially the one that is that I think that, but let's discuss it. Maybe I'm wrong. I think the transformative approach, except if you need quick ceasefire again, this type of things where you need a quick solution because people are dying, and so that's absolutely clear
Yeah.
for that. But for something long-lasting, sustainable, really pointing to the future, I have the impression we have to go to something more transformative, especially if communities continue to live together or next to each other. Um, Again, he's not really saying that, but I see that this triggered my reflection to say that we can go for something quick and fast track and so on. Sometimes it's also a matter of budget, available time, or whatever. But I would say, to sum it up, the transformative approach on long term is better.
Mm.
What do you say to that?
Yeah, I think it's not negotiable in my mind as well.
Mhm.
But I think his point that he makes really resonated with me. He basically questions, is the negotiation space, is the process in the conversation, in the negotiation, in the mediation, is this the space for transformation? And this, what he observes, what I
Mm.
find that very
I
valid. He
see.
says, at the negotiation table, you don't necessarily have a psychological shift or a change of attitudes. But, and I think not always, I think you also have it. And often it's exactly that crucial point where you have two sides together that for the first time face each other. You need that to create actually this transformation in a way. But I don't think it's exclusively the way it works. But
Mhm.
what I would then find interesting is, okay, if the negotiation space is not the space for transformation, where is it? Because I also think, as you say, for me, it's actually something that is, in particular, as he raises sustainability, and that's one of the critiques he says that one could object to the new model, is like, is a fast track, like a fast approach, is it sustainable? And I would actually ask that. And in my mind, if it's not transformative, it's very hard to be sustainable.
I think the risk is also, I can see that point. The question is the negotiation space the space for transformation? That's, I think, a good point to discuss. Um, on one side, I would think there's a risk that if you go for fast track and then we have an agreement, everybody's happy, and the transformational part will be forgotten or will not.
Mhm.
That might be a risk. It's okay, everybody's happy, we got a deal, let's move on, and then not much more happens. That might be a risk. And the other thing is, well, you can have something extremely interest based where you can find fast track deal because there's an interest, an immediate interest, like tangible interest. Now, something, you give me A, I give you B, and that's what we both immediately need right now. And we got a, like a first part of a deal on this fast track. Yes. But I think for more sustainable deals, for something more than just the fast track, the quick deal, if it go into, I don't know, community healing, reform process,
Yeah.
transition process, and so on.
Yeah.
I think even for the deal for that, of course, if you do later on, if you do community healing and so on later on, restorative justice, there's not a negotiation space, so you do that later.
Exactly.
That I see.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
But I think to get to a deal for this type of agreements, I think you need a kind of transformation in the negotiator's mind
Mm.
to agree on that.
Mm. Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I would hope, and maybe I don't know, from my side, I'm happy to sort of conclude with this. I think there's some really interesting thoughts in that would benefit from being elaborated further. So
Mm,
maybe he himself or the institute will continue the discussion, or somebody else will pick up on it. And I think to be also to be fair, he says himself, so this is a new model and it would need to be tested and tried out and vetted. And so hopefully, that will happen, and also more people will pick up on it and maybe work around it, and research more, because I think it would definitely benefit from
mm,
it.
mm. Absolutely. And then hopefully there is a new version at some point, and then we
Mm.
can discuss it again. No, it's interesting. It made me reflect on a couple of points.
Yeah.
And as always, it adds up. Gives new visions, new thinking points, and it's always
Yeah,
enriching.
yeah, definitely. And I actually quite like, I think we like to believe in certain principles, as we all do. I think in all professions, we believe in certain things. And I think it's very healthy to once in a while question your assumptions and revisit, does this still hold true for me? And am I ready to let it go? Or is this something I definitely think has to happen? Like, as we just discussed, I think always interesting to go back to things like transformation and inclusivity, right? And
Mm.
revisit them as principles.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
all
So
right.
thank you, Katrine.
Thank you, Pascal.
And
It's as usual a pleasure to see you, and quite happy to see the landscape in the back of your
and the sun.
camera developing into summer, from winter to spring to summer. It's nice.
Absolutely.
All right.
Good. Yeah, looking forward for the next talk.
Yeah. Thanks to
And
everybody who attended and who will watch. And we look forward to staying in touch.